where the Darlington campus of the University of Sydney is located, and I'd like to pay my respects to Gadigal elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Rupal Ismin. I'm the director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub, which helps research commercialization happen at the university. We're an incubator here within the research portfolio at the University of Sydney. We also run a co-working space where Janet is calling just a couple doors down. So if you are a small business or startup looking to collaborate with the university and need a hand in terms of those introductions and so forth, drop me a line. And if you need a place to work and you're working with the university, we're also available for you. I'll be dropping a couple Zoom links into the chat on the way. So the Australian Circular Economy Conference is a partnership of a few different initiatives out of the University of Sydney and Circular Australia. And the conference is chaired by Professor Ali Abbas, who excitingly was just named yesterday Australia's Chief Circular Engineer. So this conference has spanned 3 days, and today's the last day. So I'll drop in that agenda. But we've had some really fantastic talks on various kind of technical and research initiatives that are happening at research organizations and in the broader kind of market. And today's talk is more about kind of business models around the circular economy. So we are here to talk about the square side of circular, asking tough questions of 3 founders operating in the circular economy. I've been to a few really interesting events over the last kind of couple days, and a lot of the conversations were around incentives and collaborations and business models. You know, is it worth the cost of circular, the economic cost of doing things circular for an individual organization? How do you get people on board? What is that framework of engagement? So it seems prescient that we have these 3 founders here today with really quite different business models and imperatives joining us. So today we have Janet Salem, who I met a couple months ago in Janet's capacity as the founder of Footprint Lab, which is a member of the Sydney Knowledge Hub. Janet has spent years working on the most credible carbon footprint data out of research organizations like CSIRO and the University of Sydney. And they set up shop not too long ago to help commercialize and consult on this data. She has a really interesting background because she's worked in the UN for well over a decade in the circular, in circular, including as UN Economics Affairs Officer for the circular economy. We also have Peter Tomich, who is the CEO and founder of Sustinent, which I came across Peter maybe about a year ago when I brought a group of MBA students over to Cicada Innovations to see this deep tech incubator, this fantastic deep tech incubator that we have at Tech Central. And I was really quite impressed with Sustinent because it seemed, you know, a year ago, one of the most, I guess, grown up businesses within the circular economy, like really taking kind of real kind of consumer needs and developing a business model. So Sustinent processes agriculture waste into high value resources for ag tech purposes. Their model is quite a commercial model, and it doesn't seem to rely on the consumers necessarily wanting to contribute to, you know, solutions to society's waste problems. And finally, we have Paul Riley, who is the CEO and founder of Samsara. Paul is filling in for Phil Morle, who is the partner at Main Sequence Ventures, who has been a champion of the startup world for over a decade. But I think that Paul is probably actually better equipped to speak on this. So I haven't met Paul before, but I'm really excited to speak to him today. I think there's incredible prospects because many of us, Samsara is a solution for a biotech solution that allows for ongoing recycling of plastics, so 100% recyclable plastics. I think it's a really exciting solution for us who all get a bit of anxiety from all of our plastic waste. They just recently closed a Series A of $54 million backed by Main Sequence Ventures, who is CSIRO's venture arm, Woolworths Group, W3, and Clean Energy Finance Corporation Innovation Fund. They also cleaned up an Innovation Australia 2022 energy in the energy and renewables and Australian hero category. Paul also, interestingly, is the director of Eden Brew, which is another Main Sequence venture portfolio company, which makes animal-free dairy. So we have a bunch of people online. I'll kick off with some questions, but please feel free to leave any questions in the Q&A. And as I mentioned earlier, before everyone joined on, Janet, Peter, Paul, feel free to ask some questions that you have of each other. It doesn't have to just be question and answer, so jump in whenever you feel comfortable. So enough for me. That was quite a big intro. So I'm going to start off perhaps by, I'd love all of you to take about, a couple minutes to introduce yourselves and your business, and of course, emphasizing kind of the circular component of your business. So Paul, I might hand it over to you first.
Sure, thanks for that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Samsara is an envirotech company with a focus on resolving the mixed plastics waste crisis. We were formed coming up to 2.5 years ago by the CSIRO's Main Sequence, Woolworths and ANU to commercialise a technology out of ANU, which uses enzymes to depolymerise plastic. It was more than just we always wanted to be more than just a single-use plastics business. And they had at that stage a polyester enzyme that could depolymerise polyester, be it a bottle, a meat tray, a punnet, be it could be fabric, it could be your footy jersey. Regardless of colour, state of the plastic, we could depolymerise it and take it back to monomers, so the original building blocks of plastic, and we could do that in an incredibly sustainable way, and we could do it in an economic way. So in under 1 hour, I can take a piece of polyester now, and I can turn that into monomers, which are virgin equivalent monomers, not derived from fossil fuels, so replacing fossil fuel derived monomers for infinite recycling into plastics. So the challenge with current technologies in recycling are that none of them really are recycling. They're all downcycling. Yeah. And we were looking for that solution that was true recycling in that plastics world. We've also got a nylon enzyme. We've got polyurethane, polycarbonate solution. So if you start to think about where this technology could go, if I've got polyester, nylon, polyurethane, I've got fast fashion. I can then take a piece of activewear and put it through the process, and I can take the monomers from that activewear out to be recycled back into fibre again. I can take mixed fibres. I can take coloured fibres because the enzyme deals with the colour, and each enzyme is designed only to depolymerise one particular plastic. Now, all of that allows us to deal with hard to recycle plastics. It allows us to deal with multi-layered plastics. And as you said, recently we raised $54 million for the building of our first facility, and that focus of that first facility will be on polyester. And we're working with some of the largest FMCG groups in the world about bringing infinite recycling to life. We expect to have that facility up and going by the end of 2023, early 2024. And the great thing about the tech and why people are so attracted to it is not just the economics and the fact that we can meet market price for our rPET. We're doing it at a very, very low carbon impost. So our process doesn't melt plastic. It's very low heat. The actual enzymatic part of the process is 8 minutes, and it's carried out at about 45 degrees. And as a result, compared to other advanced recycling technologies, our carbon footprint is about 40% of virgin plastics. So it plays very nicely into people who are targeting net zero by 2030, 2040, because we don't deliver a process that's detrimental to their journey to get to that net zero target. So incredibly exciting technology. We're very excited by the fact that it's come out of an Australian university, and it's world leading. And we think that now with the capital that's been made available to us, and it's not just Main Sequence, we've had Temasek come in, we've had Breakthrough Victoria, we've had DCVC out of the US, who have all spent months exploring the technology and the business model and have confirmed just how exciting this opportunity is for Australia in terms of circularity. So excited to be here today to talk about circularity and the plastics crisis.
That is amazing, Paul. We're all probably just everyone on this call just super excited about Samsara and just the possibilities that a technology like this can afford, and just the rethinking that a technology like this can afford is amazing. I have lots of follow-up questions, but I'm just going to have one quick, easy one before we get to someone else. Where is the plant going to be located? Where's the new facility going to be located?
The commercial facility will be in Victoria.
Great.
Right.
Well, speaking of kind of, solutions that are not downcycling, Peter, I'd love to hand it over to you next.
Sure. So first of all, thanks very much, and thanks for having us here. My name is Peter, and I'm the co-founder of Sustinent. Sustinent is, I guess, at its heart, really truly circular economy in action, from perspective not only of business model, but also from the products and the way we do things. So our primary purpose is to take waste that is generated in agricultural production, namely plant-based, on large scale, and turn it into an array of different products that are fully eco-friendly and recyclable. And then we also have parts of our model that you can take the products that we can produce and bring them back into the system to reproduce them into a different set of products. So we take circularity to the full extent without creating additional waste streams and fully utilizing natural processes, namely fungi, which are natural recyclers of this world. Currently, we have just opened a first plant in Northern New South Wales, and we are working with Northern New South Wales sugar industry, processing hundreds of thousands of tons. Well, we're starting with a smaller plant, obviously, but the target is to process about 200,000 to 300,000 tons of material that's available there, which is generally burnt every season. So not only from air pollution, but also to releasing carbon from the plant that, yes, it's sequestered from the air, but we are preventing doing that. And that is turned into very sellable commodities such as stock feed, or much more higher end commodities that are extracts for medical industry or human consumption, or even into mycelium products such as mycelium leather replacements or packaging materials, or even construction materials and boards. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, look, I'll add a little bit about our business model, which is somewhat different. Unlike traditional business models where you simply build your plant and buy the products and so forth, we actually integrate with existing infrastructure pieces on board. So basically producers and processors of materials and agricultural products, and we enable them to generate revenue, use their existing non-utilized resources, further adding to the whole utilization of the ecosystem, creating additional revenue stream and making agricultural industry more resilient. So
great. Lots of follow-up questions there, but I guess the one quick one that I want to ask is, can you tell me kind of your team or your resources spent, who do you employ the most? Is it data scientists? Is it account managers? Like where does most of Sustinent's business, like where is it? What do you?
Well, that's quite interesting question, because industry being what it is currently in the lay of the land it's quite fragmented. So what we do is we cover a wide span of needs, because we fully vertically and horizontally integrate what we do and wrap ourselves around existing capabilities. In practical sense, we do have needs for data people just as much as PhD people who are working in R&D side, just as much as operational logistics and plant operations, all the way to sales and delivery. So from branding and stuff all the way down to data collection and traceability, quality control. So we have developed end-to-end ecosystem that works with existing infrastructural pieces and then bridges the gaps between them. So we are not a one-track thing.
Great. And Janet, over to you. You have kind of the most, I guess, broader perspective on this issue with your background at the UN, but also kind of what you have a founder hat on. So I'm hoping you can maybe cover a little bit of both in your intro.
Yeah, thanks so much, RuPaul. So yeah, I spent 17 years at the UN working on circular economy, resource efficiency, sustainable consumption and production. So I've loved how this topic has evolved, thank God, because it's much needed. There's so much waste, and I'm seeing sort of updated data from my old colleagues showing that we're sort of globally only about 2% circular. So, you know, it's quite crazy to think that we can be so wasteful. And a lot of our work was about supporting businesses and innovations like Peter's and Paul's to see, you know, how you can harness best technological capabilities, you know, creativity solutions. And also, you know, it's quite a systemic, you need a systems thinking approach to this, because neither of their businesses will operate in isolation. There will be a lot of sort of surrounding infrastructure and cooperation to make them happen. So all of that needs to awareness raising, policy, finance, so all of these things. Another thing it needs, which became a bit of an obsession of mine, is, I guess, the data to support the pipeline for demand for all of these solutions. So that's where Footprint Lab comes in. We want to make it easy for everyone to know the carbon footprint of anything that involves a transaction. So that can involve a portfolio of investments or loans. It can involve a receipt at the point of sale. And then we provide raw carbon footprint data. We also have material footprint data, which I'm hoping will really support circular economy thinking and policies. So far, we haven't had as much traction with that as with carbon footprints, but, you know, fingers crossed. But so if people who make purchasing decisions, if they can know the carbon footprint of the goods and services and merchants that they purchase from, then they can have the option to choose a lower carbon option. So imagining someone who's looking for a PET based product, you know, if they can find something that's been generated using Samsara plastic, or if they can, you know, get a micro leather handbag made of the mycelium from Sustinent, that will surely have a lower carbon footprint. And we'd love to, you know, really get that, help set up the data infrastructure to get that information into the hands of any purchasing decision makers. So we're data as a service. We're working with people who organize money, categorize it, and collect data about it so that they can enrich that with carbon footprint data.
Great. And that kind of dovetails nicely into my second question. And you touched on this a little bit, Janet, but, you know, the question I want to ask is who are your customers? And, you know, and the reason that I want to ask this is because is it purely, are you trying to convince someone of something? Like you have to kind of move the market in a way that requires, you know, potentially like industry group action and you know, lobbying and that sort of thing? Or do you think that your business is tapping into an individual customer's needs that you're fine to kind of go without that broader policy change? So Janet, I might hand that over to you. You probably have the toughest time answering that question, or the most complicated sort of customer, diverse range of customers. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say at the moment, the main users of this type of data are carbon calculators. So they're the ones that really sit at that interface with a company, and they'll trawl through the operations and expenditures of that company, and then they will look for data to assess the carbon footprint of the operations as a whole. And you can apply that at the micro, meso, macro level. So carbon footprint calculators, it's a huge and growing market globally. So that's the sort of easier users that have a real pain point about accessing credible current data with good data resolution, consistently updated, etc. That's great. But our vision is that this needs to be normalized and mainstreamed into financial transactions in general. And we've seen a huge rise in the digitization of transactions, particularly since COVID. So, you know, if you think of how often you use cash nowadays, it's not that often. So there's a real digital trail behind a lot of our our consumption patterns as consumers, but also along supply chains. And that data, when you look at the back end of it, contains a lot of enrichment about, well, what businesses made the transaction, where are they located, what sectors are they classified in? That's all actually captured. So it's very easy then for us to layer in the carbon footprint that matches that sector and that location and that point in the supply chain. So why not enrich it? And then looking into the future, as companies and products become carbon certified, you can then layer in, further resolution so that instead of the sector ID only, you'll have the business ID or ABN. And then at the receipt level, you have the SKU or product identifier number. And so we really need to get this infrastructure started so that the finance sector, and particularly banking and fintechs, they're getting used to enriching also with environmental data. But there is some advocacy around this as well, because we need the right policies, we need the right industry associations taking action. So there are lots and lots of guidelines. There are high expectations for carbon disclosure in the finance sector. So that work is already, really underway and moving really quickly. So this actually starts to be a pain point for banks as well. But there are also, we're advocating for more of this to happen at the product level. With the EU bringing in digital product passports, I think this is something where Australia could also come to the table and enable that kind of the digital twin of these products and services, so that data can have a good place to go with the product and can be carried through as products move up a supply chain. For instance, the raw materials for plastics or the biomass from Sustinent.
Yeah, great. And this is, maybe a follow-up question is targeted at Paul. But, how important is the integrity of that information? Are you trying to convince people of the integrity of kind of the end solution? With Paul, I'm thinking about the soft plastics issue with and losing consumers' trust. Janet, with you, do these carbon footprint calculators actually care how, or is it just kind of placating customers? Paul, you're on mute. I don't know if you.
Yeah, look, it's incredibly important that consumer confidence is maintained, and the industry is not doing a good job. I mean, the reality is that most plastics recycling is a myth. It's not really recycling. It's mythical. I mean, we all make the effort and go and put our bottles and our plastics into the yellow bin, and 91% of it ends up in landfill.
91%, did you say?
Yeah, all the stuff out of your plastic bin ends up in landfill. It's the only effective recycling technology, or downcycling technology, is really taking your bottles back to your earn and return scheme. Those clear, clean bottles go through a mechanical recycling process, but they can only go through that process 4 or 5 times before the plastic's degraded to the point where they have to end up in landfill as well. So there's been a lot of myth around plastics recycling, and credibility needs to be restored. And the recent REDcycle debacle is further evidence of that. REDcycle was never really recycling. It was a
maybe just talk people through what that is in case they haven't heard of what happened.
So the soft plastics recycling program that was with Woolworths and Coles, where which collapsed several weeks ago as the plastics were being, it was identified that they were storing them in warehouses and they weren't being recycled. And as noble as that project was to get rid of what is an incredibly difficult plastic, LDPE is a very, very difficult plastic to deal with. It was going into road base. It wasn't recycling, it's going into road base, and then the microplastics from the road base break down and end up in the environment anyway. We'd be much better off redesigning plastics and not using LDPE, and using a recyclable plastic like a polyester would be a much better option if we have to use plastic at all. I mean, I'm very much in favour of eliminate as much plastic as you possibly can. But the credibility needs to be there for people to trust what they're doing and trust that they're actually making a difference. And that's where Footprint Lab comes into play. People need to understand that, you know, if when we go to market and are promoting our particular plastic, that it does have a low carbon footprint, and there's evidence to support that. And we've done our LCA to support that at the moment for our customers, that it is infinitely recyclable, and that we are diverting product from landfill, and that we're replacing fossil fuels, and we're putting that full stop beside the fossil fuel industry that we all want to achieve in terms of circularity. So that's how that sort of technology and business tie in very nicely with what we're trying to achieve. I want people to go to the shelf and see an infinitely recycled symbol and say, yes, this is truly recycled, this is diverted from landfill, this has replaced fossil fuels. So that's why it's so important for us.
Great. Peter, how, with your customers, how much of a messaging do you talk about the circular, or is it purely kind of an economic sell that you make?
Look, we have two sides of our business. One is actually partnering with people who have waste, and the other one is then the people who use products we make. And both sides of the chain are actually very aware of circularity and environmental impacts. Now, the reality of it is also that they're only interested in doing things as long as you can make them commercially viable. So while there is a big interest and a big push and a big awareness there is also a commercial realities that you have to match in order to make it viable for anyone to do it. So that also adds a little bit of a barrier to new entrants and businesses, because then you as a new business need to prove both things before you can actually proceed with your clients and customers and so forth, which is great from a circularity point of view, but from a point of view of starting a business becomes much more difficult. We are obviously in a lucky position that we are working in that environment, but by a virtue of what we propose and how we integrate, and we are talking to some really large global producers overseas as well as domestically, there is a significant awareness and push of how do we reuse our waste and how do we repurpose it in order to minimize footprint, to the point that some businesses that we spoke with, again, global brands, refuse to call them waste and they call them co-products. And even from the language to the psychology of internal psychology of those businesses is forcing people to think, what can we do with co-products and how can we reuse them rather than just throw them away. So there is a big level of awareness around.
Great. Anything to add on that topic, anybody, before I move on?
I did want to just say something about the low actual recycling rate of plastic. It is very depressing, but I do encourage everyone to still separate your wastes, because any government will tell you the hardest part of recycling is getting people to separate their waste. And even if they eventually move to a recycling that commingles two waste streams that are currently collected or expected to be separated, they would generally keep those two streams separate, because that behavior change is the sort of heaviest lifting that governments have to do. So still put your plastic in the recycling, send that message out. I agree, return and earn is probably best if you can, but still put your stuff in the recycling.
Great. Janet, you seem to have a bit of optimism. You know, you said that you're happy about how this conversation has evolved over the last 17 years. New South Wales seems to be, you know, as a state government, seems to be promoting circular quite a bit. You know, can you maybe talk about the policies that they have enacted over the last X amount of years? I don't know if this is all recent. From my perspective, it's all happened over the last kind of, 2-3 years. But can you talk a little bit about the policy that has been enacted in New South Wales that have encouraged this behavior?
Well, New South Wales now has a circular economy strategy, which is a really good starting point. And it is very focused on the waste side of things, but there are some upstream elements as well. And one of the things I didn't think they would do, but they did recently, is ban the single-use plastics, or some types of them, particularly in takeaway food. Now, that implementing a ban is very expensive for governments. So it's always better when, businesses, individuals take proactive approaches. But at the same time, I think a ban is really good for businesses, especially startups, that want to offer a circular service. So, if we think about those who are offering reusable or rental coffee cups, or takeaway containers, for instance, then it's really good that they can operate in a market where the alternative, which is the single-use option, is being phased out. So that's something that I think is really strong from New South Wales government. The other thing they've done is they've set up New South Wales Circular, which has now been so successful. It was kind of co-opted to Circular Australia, so it's become much larger. And that is a not-for-profit that can really focus on finding and addressing some of these barriers to circular economy, and so highlighting, how this could work along a particular supply chain, for instance, solar cells, and then gathering industry around that, along the whole supply chain, just to show that this is an entire supply chain, that the circle needs to close, right? So you need to engage everyone in that supply chain so that the recyclers can eventually talk to the product developers, and that all those steps in between have happened. So that's one thing that they've done. They've assembled a lot of supply chain teams. They've also put together several task forces, so that specific areas of influence, like there's a finance task force, there's also circular communities task force, so that they can really assemble the right stakeholders to really focus on the issue from that perspective. The other thing they've done, which I love, is they've set up an effort to establish what are circular economy metrics, so that we can kind of judge things on an equal basis, and that someone has put in some thought into what kind of data can inform us in order that we make evidence-based decisions about the status and the choices that we have. So they're now in the final stages of setting that up, and of course it includes things like carbon footprint, material footprint, but also recycling rates. The more we can keep track of all of this, then the better people can design solutions. And Peter and Paul don't have to do as much heavy lifting to understand where, at least the local market, I mean, as I know you guys are look beyond Australia, but at least locally you should know where things stand, so that you know where to focus and inform yourselves. So I think we've got a long way to go. If we look at other countries, even states, South Australia has done some pretty amazing stuff thanks to some really remarkable individuals and policy leadership. But yeah, in New South Wales, much larger, denser population, it's really good to see recently that these things are happening.
Great. And Paul and Peter, have you seen, I guess, a direct effect from some of these policies on your businesses? And I guess, or another kind of side of that question is, are there any kind of policies that you want to see kind of move in a different direction in New South Wales or beyond?
Well, speaking from a plastics perspective, the government hasn't even gone close to what we need in terms of legislation and policy. Banning of some of the single-use plastics is great, but we've got models we can look to in Europe where there are minimum content requirements, recycled content requirements in packaging. In some European countries, it's up to 60%, and it's mandated. The Australian industry just isn't going to get there on their own. Whilst virgin plastic is so cheap, they will continue to produce it and use it, and they won't be forced into actually changing their behaviour unless the government legislates And that's not happening in Australia. We need to do that. We should be legislating minimum recycled contents. That has a dual effect of not just eliminating fossil fuel derived plastics, and it has the effect of driving investment into the space to ensure that those minimum recycled contents mandates can be met. And you've seen that clearly in Europe, where, as I say, some countries have 60% minimum recycled content in packaging. And that's driven a whole raft of investment into all of the downstream steps that are required to get you to a circular economy. We're not doing that. We have aspirational targets. You know, we put our hand up and we say we're hoping to get to 25% by 2025. And I know for a fact that the corporates, if it costs them extra, they won't put themselves in an uncompetitive position to try and hit those targets. So we're not going to get there.
And
so
because
we're a laggard. We're a laggard in the world in terms of legislation and policy.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and it's because of business lobbying.
But businesses aren't. I'm not saying they're lobbying against it, but there's nothing to encourage them to do the right thing.
No, I guess my question is why aren't we more aggressive? Why isn't New South Wales more aggressive on some of this policy front? Like, is it consumers? Is it business? Is it logistics? And the
consumers want it. The consumers want it, but you know, virgin plastic's really cheap, incredibly cheap, and you know, people aren't prepared to accept that there's a cost of carbon and build that into the products that they're delivering. They're just not doing it. We need to take a harder line. We need to eliminate single-use plastics. We need to redesign plastics. We need to reuse them, and we need to legislate so that we do have a true recycling industry that delivers circularity.
I mean, look, we find pretty much similar things to Paul. At the end of the day, while the awareness is there, it's really economically driven, and we have similar things. I mean, agriculture is an industry that supports a lot of people, especially in rural areas, and that's politically sensitive. So tackling or putting legislations that limit what people can do there is very tough. Like if you want to stop, let's say, sugarcane burning, that would bring into question commodity that's a significant export for Australia, and with global prices already being thin margin prices, that becomes even bigger problem. So any solutions that we introduce have to cater for economic realities, and hurdles to introduce them become even harder. So until there's an impetus for legislative compliance, it's very, very hard to cross those barriers. And we have the similar problem here. I mean, as Paul said, it's cheaper for us to get barley or something from overseas than grow it locally, or to use it locally, or reuse something locally that can be used as a substitute, versus buying it from overseas where dumping policies of cheap labor is in place. So
my last question before or maybe perhaps my last question before I turn it over to the audience is, as founders of these businesses, as leaders of these relatively early stage businesses, do you feel pressure to be a net zero company, even though kind of as a net, your whole business is about kind of awareness and taking out resources from the environment? Like, do you feel pressure to kind of be net zero, or to be, the exemplar of having green operations?
I think it's what we are. I mean, we've set out to do no more damage from the very beginning, and we've set ourselves up so that we will be a net zero business. It was our intent from the very start. There's no pressure there. It's what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's similar for us. I mean, is there a legal pressure or even commercial pressure? Questionable. But in terms of our own intent and our own drive, exactly what we are doing. So everything we are doing in business, we are thinking, what impact is that, or can we mitigate that, or how soon can we mitigate it down the road? But again, it's a hard balancing line between trying to create something truly green and sustainable versus trying to make something commercially viable in an environment where, as Paul said, virgin plastic is cheap. So, that's exactly why we are here, and we are trying to make that real. But if there is no impetus, then even what we are doing becomes less sustainable and non-viable. So it becomes a problem.
Jana, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I'd love to hear questions from the audience. I think the examples from Peter and Paul just really crystallize some of the topics that are so common across the circular economy domain. So I'm very keen to hear more from them.
The last question actually I'll ask before we go over to them is, can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the business, or why you decided to find the business? Peter, I might start with you.
Sure. My involvement became incidental, believe it or not, like many things, I guess, in my life. I used to work in consulting and finance and accounting and IT and things like that. And I guess I came to that point in my life where I was looking at something else in my career, in my late 30s, early 40s. And I came across Cicada Incubator, where I literally got dragged for free beer to come to a pitch day. And this is where my co-founder was pitching the idea of insect farming and green economy and all those kind of things, which really piqued my interest. And we started talking, and the rest is history, as he describes it. So I can't say it's been on the forefront of my mind to do specific this, but it has been on the forefront of my mind. How do I turn a consulting career into something where I can not only make something, but also give back or bring a different aspect to it? So that's how I ended up here.
Great.
And so I've been in or around venture capital for most of my life, and I was working with the main sequence guys who they're thematic investors. So trying to solve big problems, how do we decarbonize? How do we feed the world? How do we feed those 10 billion people? And working in their office as an entrepreneur in residence, they asked me to look at some of the technologies that they'd identified that they weren't really sure what they were going to do with. And I came across this technology whilst there, and in some ways I was floored. I'd never seen an opportunity like this, or a technology like this that could move the dial on carbon the way this could move the dial on pollution, and do it in an economically sensible way. And that's how I grabbed onto it. It was all about, finally there's a solution there that I can see that can make a true difference, especially in the plastics and the carbon space. Thank
you. Jana?
Yeah, amazing to hear those two stories. So for me, I was working on an innovation portfolio at the UN, and always looking for solutions that we can highlight in some way as representing the future we want to see. And I was working a lot with data from the CSIRO, actually, and the University of Sydney at the time, getting that into kind of informing policymakers and public reports. And at the same time, I could see how it was fitting very neatly into digital transaction data, but couldn't really find anyone that was doing it well. So started a PhD on the topic with Sydney Uni, the team that makes the data. And then businesses just started asking for data sets and telling me that they needed. And so I thought, well, I guess, I'd like to do this full time rather than trying to fit it in on the sides of a UN career. So that's when I took a leap earlier this year to say, okay, What does this look like if I focus on it full time? Can we get financial institutions to integrate this data? Can we support carbon calculators to get really granular and help businesses? And that's, that's the journey we're setting out to do.
Great. And we have a Q&A board that's going off, so I'm just going to ask a couple of questions from there. So I want to take the first one from Jade Fennell. Thanks for the question, Jade. How do these innovations ensure their solutions don't create new problems? Like, how much do you guys kind of think about human-centered or life-centered design? And then the second part of the question is, what values and roles are important to allow innovators to go fast, but in an ethical way?
Look, we've been very conscious as we build this business, or our business Samsara, to ensure that we do no more harm to the environment. And we talk about climate repair, and we assess every step of our process to ensure that there are no negative impacts on the environment. So we've got a recovery rate of about 99.7% of the plastic that goes into our process. There's no leakage into the environment of any water or any chemicals or any additives. Everything is captured and reused where possible.
Oh.
And we've been conscious of ensuring that that's the case from the very, very beginning. And what the second part of the question was about pace and cadence and
moving fast, but being
it's critical, and cadence is critical for a startup. And ensuring that you hit your milestones and your deliverables for your investors is always really important. And we set ourselves short sprints towards our key objectives with our investor set, so that they've got confidence that we're delivering and that we're improving and that we're moving down that path towards the commercial outcome that they require. I mean, that's the harsh reality of being a startup, is that your investors aren't doing it for fun, they're doing it for a return. And you need to deliver to those investors and ensure that they continue to support you, because capital is oxygen. It's as simple as that.
Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, did you want me to answer the same question?
Yeah, you have. We can go through a few of them, but I'd love to hear.
It's very similar to Paul's. I mean, we do exactly the same thing. I mean, we are looking at how do we use as much of our natural resources and make a positive impact, move a needle, because the problem we are dealing with is it's on a commercial scale, and we are gearing up to deal with things that are in millions of tons rather than just hundreds of thousands of tons. So therefore, anything that we do has an amplified impact millionfold if we do something in process that is detrimental or has impact to nature, negatively impacts nature. Because whatever you do in process, whatever you put in there, every input amplifies significantly. So it is a great responsibility and a great thought. How can I make something commercially viable, as close to nature as possible, with carefully thought out logistics and processes that can make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and when it comes down to startups and cadence and things like that, it's a challenge, because on one side you have investors that are pushing you, and as Paul says, they are there for returns, they're there for outcomes, they are there for progress. But when you're working in industries, especially when we work in agriculture, which works in seasons rather than weeks or months, bridging that gap can become a challenge, and you need special kind of investors that are much more in there for a not only longer haul, but also for a deep tech nature of the business. We are not an app, similar to Paul. Investors these days are so geared up to an app. You make an app, you scale it fast, you get million users, and off you go, and here is your return, and here is a quick cadence.
Yeah.
We work on different cadences. I mean, Paul's one sounds like a deep tech business as well, and Janet's as well. I mean, there's lots of technology and research and data and all those things before you see a single outcome. And finding the right investors and the right support infrastructure, whether it's from government, whether it's from private sector or even industry, is quite hard, because everything is geared up for a shorter term. Now, next 3 months, next 6 months, where is it? When the life doesn't work like that, at least in our spheres.
We have a question from Sasha about standards. So is there an Australian standard for the circular economy? I know, Janet, you're talking about metrics, which can help kind of streamline things and have people work towards a more common goal. But the second part, so let me just read the question. Is there an Australian standard for the circular economy? It could assist prescribing compliant material footprint in products, which are allowed to come to market or seek/show that a premium offer may have some justifiable consumer options.
Yep. So there's no standard that I'm aware of. I think what works much better is to be very specific, like what Paul mentioned on having minimum content requirements, which governments can do once the market is ready to provide them. I think that sometimes there's a bit of a chicken and egg on policy versus market readiness. I know in the EU what they do, particularly in the Netherlands, they're quite good. They'll say, once the market is able to provide an alternative at a comparable price, we will start to introduce legislation, some policy to say that you need to choose that, whether it's a ban or a tax or whatever it is. But like, I think what Peter raised, or maybe it was Paul, does the finance, will the finance be made available before policy? That's a bit of a question. Sometimes you need that policy to come in place. But really to the question, that there isn't a standard, but sector specific, product specific seems to work much better.
Greta, who's our community manager at the Sydney Knowledge Hub, asks, as founders, in what ways do you think that accelerators and incubators can support companies operating in the circular economy? Or Janet and Peter, maybe you could talk to how Cicada and Hub is.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, go for it, Janet.
Yeah.
Please,
well, just being at the very early stage, firstly, it's the vote of confidence. So it's making sure that, there's someone that thinks you have a good idea and can challenge you in the right way to advance it. And then I also think it's being around other people in a similar situation. So having good peers in this, as a founder is incredibly important. And lastly, the most by far useful thing has been introductions to people who can serve as temporary advisors or even potentially longer term formal advisors. We just haven't, especially as a researcher and as a former civil servant, having access to people who can provide particularly commercial advice and strategic advice couldn't be more valuable.
Great. And Peter.
When you talk about incubators, especially the more targeted ones like Cicada, and they go beyond just providing, the desk space and basic facilities, they effectively become champion of your business. And what they are doing is they are taking their connections and their place and influence, whether it's political, whether it's regional or aligned businesses or whatever, and they are championing your cause and giving you opportunity to present yourself or to become visible. And when you are in early stages, that visibility then opens doors to funding, money, alignment opportunities, collaborations, whatever it is, but it expands your horizons. Now, on top of that, they also obviously provide, basic infrastructure, office space, internet, power, water, all those kind of day-to-day stuff. But they also, as Janet said, provide that commercial reality of running a business. And this is where it was very interesting, because I only ended up here because of Cicada. Because Cicada was that linchpin that brought someone from commercial world like myself to a scientist that came from scientific world, like my co-founder Phil. Our paths would not cross very often if it wasn't for incubator like this and opportunities that they brought us together. And there is a significant gap between ideas and PhD research stuff and then making them real. Yeah. So what I haven't seen is a lot of crossover of people from commercial world intersecting with the research world and trying to bridge that gap. I mean, there are many great ideas and lots of money and time spent and resource spent in research, but very few times that actually makes into commercial reality. So it's great to see, for example, great ideas like Paul has, and the path that he took. That's something that was really great in research, is actually starting to make an outcome in Australia itself, as opposed to just being bought overseas or taken away or buried somewhere else in a bigger corporate.
Yeah, and that's the role that the Sydney Knowledge Hub plays. We spend a lot of time kind of exposing researchers to pathways of commercialization and getting them thinking about introducing them to people like Main Sequence Ventures and Cicada's programming, and Janet's part of our inventor mentoring program, which Main Sequence is a mentor of. But I couldn't agree more that we need more of a fluid and permeable ecosystem between those that are inventing and those that can help bring ideas forward. So we have 3 minutes left, and I'd like to close on kind of a positive note. So if you guys can, tell me about, the thing that's the most exciting thing that's going to happen with your business, either recently or in the next 6 months. So
it's all exciting.
Yeah.
Look,
it's easy to say after a $54 million raise.
That's right. So look, for us, the plant is incredibly exciting. The fact that we're actually bringing that to life, and we've got customers, and we're ready to go, and we're ready to sell product into those customers. But I think for me, what's even more exciting is that we're now, with our library of enzymes, we're developing a solution to plastics where there was no solution. We have a solution. We've got 4 enzymes. We're working on 13 more with ANU. We're trying to resolve those really difficult challenges in recycling. 9 billion tons of plastic already made. We don't need another piece of plastic made from fossil fuels. It's all here. And if we can get this right, then we'll be able to never, we'll put a full stop beside fossil fuels, and that's going to be important.
Great. Peter.
For us, I mean, as Paul said, everything is exciting, but I guess the story of startup is that one day it's most exciting, next day is the most treacherous, and then it comes back again. So the whole
best or the worst day of your life.
That's right. That's swings and roundabouts of startups. So if you ask me today versus if you ask me tomorrow, it's going to be a different answer. But look, we've crossed the threshold from an idea, a lab, into commercial sphere. We just commissioned a factory that is starting to produce commercial products. So now we are at that stage of, we spent almost 5 years getting to this point. Where do we go next, and how do we then accelerate this and put many of our other ideas back into a pipeline and on process, procedures and stuff, from internally strengthening business to actually replicating the factories around Australia and starting to make a difference in various different regions. We have a number of people from overseas who are trying to talk to us and are interested in what we do and how we do it. So going offshore is also on cards. And of course, then, trying to change a regional viability and industry profitability, especially agriculture, while reducing impacts of floods and droughts and so forth on the industry itself, making it more resilient to being able to process damaged goods and damaged plants is part of our story as well. So we are also looking, how do we bring that regional sustainability back in play?
Thanks, Peter. Janet?
Yeah, for us, it's 2 things. The launch of the global data set, where we'll have over 160 different countries and about 100 sectors per country, and several environmental footprints as well. So it's just sort of an enormous data set, and converting that also into an API, so it's a lot easier to integrate into sort of the digital banking workflows. So very excited about that.
Great. Well, Paul, Peter, and Janet, that was a really fantastic discussion. I think that is also just having more people exposed to your incredible businesses is really fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you all the attendees for joining us as well. I know Zoom events aren't nearly as fun as real events, so thanks for bearing with us. And I just popped in some links. The top link there are some other sessions for the remainder of the day as the Australian Circular Economy Conference closes out. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, RuPaul. Thanks, everyone.